Crunchy. Covered in Cadbury's smooth milk chocolate. Cracker Crunchy, the champagne bar.
Now woman's own stands on its own, has everything I'm looking for. The magazine know what I mean. To give you so much more, more beauty, fashion news, top star interviews, all the help I need, all I like to read. Woman's own, you know what I like.
Dad, how many arches does the Sports Bridge got?
I don't know. You'll have to look it up. Hey, Liz, what's our postcode?
You'll have to look it up, love, from the Thompson local directory.
Please use your postcode. Then the letters you get back will be properly addressed.
Make a note of it, Dad.
Coming out here and listen to the scene. You're right, old smarty pants. Oyston, all over the name. What with his computer, newspaper, access to 5,000 bars, and a salesman who never sleeps. Oh, well, if you can't beat him, don't judge him. No, you don't have enough. I'll go over here.
The Fire Master. All the warmth, all the comfort, and all the atmosphere that you can get from a real fire. Now, how could you put a price on that? Come home to a real fire.
2 down. Legendary city.
When a great tobacco tells you just how good it is, rich, cool, slow burning, that's the Condor moment.
Outline description.
Condor.
Of course. Contour.
Condor. It's the tobacco of the moment.
Tonight at 11, there are highlights of the first day's play in the Yamaha Organs International Masters Snooker Tournament. Opening play in the Assembly Rooms derby are ex-world champion Steve Davis and Canadian Bill Weberneck. That's at 11. It's followed at midnight by the comic exploits of Butler Benson, an episode which finds him on a flight to disaster when the pilot of the governor's plane falls sick at the controls. But first, we rejoin John Pilger with his examination of the nuclear arms race, The Truth Game.
Through early morning fog I see visions of the things to be, the things that are withheld for me. I realize and I can see that suicide is painless. It brings on many changes, and I can take or leave it if I please.
One of the means of conditioning you, the public, to accept the nuclear arms race is secrecy and duplicity. That is, you're told one thing by government, and the very opposite happens in secret. When the Labour Party was returned to power in 1974, its manifesto was clear on one issue. We have renounced, it said, any intention of moving to a new generation of strategic nuclear weapons. Indeed, Mr. Callaghan, on becoming Prime Minister, promised a full and informed debate on nuclear weapons. During 1978, a series of extraordinary meetings took place in the Cabinet Office in Whitehall. These meetings were convened by Mr. Callaghan and were attended by Foreign Secretary David Owen, Chancellor of the Exchequer Dennis Healey, Defence Secretary Fred Mulley, and senior civil servants from the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence. Parliament knew nothing about these meetings, nor did other members of the Cabinet. So secret was this committee that it didn't have a name or a number. It took the decision to spend £1,000 million to massively increase the British nuclear arsenal in what was called the Cheveline programme. This £1,000 million was buried without trace in civil service accounts, and no one questioned it. And of course you knew nothing about it.
is one, a powerful new three-stage missile with a range of 4,000 nautical miles, capable of delivering multiple warheads to widely scattered targets.
Britain's new so-called independent deterrent grew out of the Cheveline program and is to be based on the American Trident missile. Trident is not a defensive nuclear weapon. It's designed to attack first. The Trident will cost around £8,000 million. The Ministry of Defense official who briefed me said, with Trident, you get more bang for a buck. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union cannot feed itself and conceals the growing poverty and hardship of its people. In the United States, unemployment in cities like Detroit and in the black ghettos is more than half the adult population, with malnutrition now officially recognized as a disease. In Britain, many of this generation may never work, and the closure of hospitals and schools is no longer news. In the 1980s, having nuclear weapons gives you more bang for a buck.
If the United Kingdom had no nuclear weapons, I think they'd be in a much stronger bargaining position. Now they're captive appendages to the United States' strategic and other nuclear weapons systems. You're just a little adjunct here of our total nuclear capability in the United States.
Well, there are contingency plans in the NATO doctrine to fire a nuclear weapon for demonstrative purposes, to demonstrate to the other side that they are exceeding the limits of toleration in the conventional area.
In November 1981, U.S. Secretary of State General Alexander Haig revealed that NATO had a plan to fire a nuclear warning shot in a time of tension. In NATO's 1977 exercises, General Haig, then Supreme Commander, ordered a first nuclear strike. Only a dry run, of course.
I can never figure out from a military point of view or an economic point of view of why the Russians would want to make an attack in Europe or on the United States. The Russians are very late imperialists. They're lousy imperialists. They come in with a heavy hand and they blunder all over the place. I don't think they're going to be successful. But dumb they are not. And they'd have to be dumb to make a frontal attack in Europe. It would be suicide for them, and they know that.
August the 17th, 1982, the Guardian newspaper reported that the Pentagon had completed a strategic master plan to give the United States the capability of winning a protracted nuclear war. August the 23rd, Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger wrote to newspaper editors complaining that the media had got American war plans all wrong.
I wrote the letter to get an unfiltered and, from my parochial point of view, correct statement of what you're actually about in Washington. I was concerned because, rightly or wrongly, and without in any way attacking the credibility or accuracy of the press, I was concerned that the impression was being given that we had a large unit in the Pentagon that was assigned to fighting protracted nuclear wars, and that is totally wrong. We have not changed the American policy, strategic or otherwise, basically at all, but the Soviet capability has changed, and our policy has always been the same, that is to maintain an effective deterrent. And an effective deterrent against nuclear war has to be one that is correctly perceived by the Soviets as being strong enough to discourage and totally deter any kind of a nuclear attack. As their capability increases, we have to strengthen and modernize our capability, and that is the only policy in which we're engaged, and it's exactly the same policy on which every American government has been engaged since the end of World War II. It ought to be kept in proportion. We allocate something under 15% of our budget to strategic weapons and nuclear capabilities. In keeping with the unanimous agreement at the Bonn Summit, we are spending the balance of our budget on strengthening and increasing our conventional capability. Again, not with the idea of launching a war or getting a protracted war or anything of the kind, but with the idea of deterring every war. It's the paradox of our time that all of the things we are trying to do in the Defense Department are focused totally and completely on preventing a war through deterrence. And if I'm completely successful in everything I'm trying to do, we'll never use any of the things
we're trying to persuade the Congress we should and need to have.
Could I just follow that
Surely.
up? Because the fears in Europe arose particularly around last October, didn't they, when President Reagan was quoted as saying he could see where you could have the exchange of tactical weapons against troops in the field without it bringing either one of the major powers to pushing the button. Now, that sounds very much like nuclear warfighting. Around the same time, Secretary Haig talked about a demonstration shot of nuclear weapons.
I think you should set that in the context in which it was said. And the context in which it was said was a hypothetical question by a Midwest editor at a group of editors meeting at the White House. And the president, as always, was trying to be very helpful in responding to all of the questions. And he gave a perfectly honest opinion, which I don't think anyone can have any particular quarrel with. It's the raising of the subject that seems to cause so much problem. And I noticed one article recently that was critical of my letter because it said I shouldn't be discussing the subject at all. Well, there's a great temptation not to discuss the subject, but sadly others aren't quite as self-restrained. The subject is being discussed, but it's being discussed, frankly, as I said in the letter, inaccurately.
The policy of nuclear deterrence, wrote Mr. Weinberger, has been approved through the political processes of the democratic nations it protects since at least 1950. That is a fine example of official truth. It implies that the West's nuclear policy evolved through the normal democratic checks and balances, when in fact the policy was conceived in utmost secrecy. Typical of this secrecy is the directive for plans to fight a protracted nuclear war, which, says the Guardian report, is part of a top-secret national security decision document that was drawn up in the autumn of 1981. President Reagan's strategic doctrine goes further towards accepting nuclear war as a practical option, in that it specifically states the goal of winning a protracted nuclear war.
The decision to use nuclear weapons in Europe is purely a U.S. decision. One of the great myths that's been perpetrated in Europe is that somehow the NATO countries, Chancellor Schmidt or Prime Minister Thatcher, will have something to say about whether or not the U.S. uses nuclear weapons. They will not. Now, we may consult with them, and we may take their advice, and we may not. But if we decide to use nuclear weapons, there's nobody in Europe that could stop us.
Is the West our way of life?
The 1979 decision to deploy cruise missiles was to counter Soviet SS-20 missiles. That was the official reason given. What is seldom mentioned is that on the integrated battlefield of Western Europe, there is already nuclear artillery and nuclear mines and all manner of small, convenient nuclear weapons.
The purpose of having a war, let me rephrase that, the purpose of battle, whether we like it or not, is to destroy the enemy and keep yourself from being destroyed. Now, you want to have as efficient weapons as you can in order to accomplish your mission. You keep pressing the technological and scientific community of your country, you see. Find us better ways to be more efficient on the battlefield to accomplish our mission. Now, that decision of 1979 reflected NATO's determination to do several things. One, to close the gap which we had in the spectrum of forces which we need in order to implement our strategy of flexible response. And secondly, to deny to the Soviet Union a sanctuary from which she could launch these kinds of weapons against Western Europe without fear of having retaliation upon her own soil from Western Europe.
First of all, these are American weapons under American control that are coming. But number two, they are a direct breach of the Khrushchev-Kennedy agreement, where it has been said there should be no such weapons stationed on the soil of allies. And these weapons, Pershing II and cruise missiles, have a completely new quality and cannot be compared to the SS-20 in our feeling, and will reach deeply into the Soviet Union. So in fact, they are there for first strike capability. And we feel that we have enough already on overkill in Europe, enough not land, but sea and air-based systems to combat any threat, even conventional forces. We feel this is completely an excess on nuclear weapons, And we also feel it's a whole new weapons generation, which we as Germans and as Europeans reject because it will mean limited nuclear war in Europe, and we will be the first victims.
General, why do you think increasing numbers of Europeans are frightened by the presence of NATO nuclear weapons in Europe?
Well, that's difficult for me to explain, you see, because I happen to believe that if we're going to deter, we have to deter at all levels, as I've said. And it seems to me that they tend to be more frightened of our stationing weapons or modernizing our weapon systems in order to accomplish that mission of keeping them from being used by the Soviet Union, more frightened of that than they are frightened of those weapons which cause us to have to modernize in order to deter.
We reject all mass destruction weapons, also the SS-20, quite clear, because they endanger us, they point at us. But the Soviet Union is confronted, in fact, by two systems.